Thank you all very much. Obviously, the audio is working. I want to welcome everyone today, either here in the room at the Society of Antiquaries or joining us online. Let me begin by asking the secretary to read the minutes from the last meeting.
The first meeting of the 130th season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 15th of November. Mr. Richard Linenthal, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, Mr. Linenthal introduced the three speakers on the Society's second grant recipients panel. Dr. Elise Watson delivered a paper entitled Seditious and Scandalous, Books Crossing Borders in the Low Countries. Dr. Tim Wade delivered a paper entitled Travel and Treason, the Library of Sir John Mason. And Dr. Evie Heinz delivered a paper entitled The Egoist Press and the Network of Modernist Print. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: the President, Mr. Giles Mandelbrot, Ms. Margaret Ford, Mr. Keith Adams, Mr. Robert Lawrie, and Dr. Elise Watson. Mr. Linenthal thanked all speakers warmly for their papers.
Thank you, Karen. Is this an accurate record? Thanks. Thank you very much. Our speaker this afternoon is David Levy. A native of San Francisco, David is retired from a 25-year career in information technology for the financial services industry. Games, books, and computers are lifelong interests, and he plays contract bridge and backgammon competitively, and his book collecting focuses on historical works, particularly those by or inspired by the late 17th and 18th century English author Edmund Hoyle, best known for his works on the rules and play of card games. David's reference collection on Hoyle is the most complete in the world, and his descriptive bibliography of some 300 editions of Hoyle is available online. He is a member of the Roxburgh Club of California and a former board member of the Book Club of California. Today, David Levy will speak to us about A Century and a Quarter of Hoyle.
Thank you, Richard, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Society for giving me the privilege of sharing my work. 15 years ago, I took a class in descriptive bibliography at the Rare Book School in Charlottesville. At the time, Terry Bellinger was the director, and in his opening remarks, he emphasized the value of the teaching collection at the Rare Book School. He said, "At the Rare Book School, you will not be able to handle a first edition of Moby Dick. You will be able to handle a book published the same day in the same city as Moby Dick. And from that utterly forgotten work, you can learn as much about rare books as you could from handling Moby Dick." Edmund Hoyle is perhaps not quite so forgotten today. He lived from 1672 to 1769, and wrote strategy guides for the popular games of the day. His books are not much read today. Some of the games have lost favor. Other games have evolved strategies since then. The books are well represented in institutional and private collections and appear frequently in the trade. Let us heed Terry's suggestion and see what can be learned from these books. If you had a bad night at the gaming tables in early 1774, you might go off to a bookseller and ask for an instructional book to improve your play. This is the only book you would have been shown, a stated 15th edition of Mr. Hoyle's Games, published in 1771 and treating the games of whist, quadrille, piquet, chess, and backgammon. Had your losses come a year later, in 1775, you would have had a choice of 3 books, all published in that year, a stated 16th edition of Mr. Hoyle's Games, unchanged from the 15th, and 2 books called Hoyle's Games Improved, one by James Beaufort, the other revised and corrected by Charles Jones. This audience will recognize 1774 as a watershed year in publishing. The House of Lords decision in Donaldson and Beckett, we'll talk about that in a moment, ended the bookseller's claim of perpetual copyright. After Donaldson, anyone was free to reprint Hoyle. In 1774, there was a single copyrighted protected Hoyle. In 1775, there were 3 in a wide open market. All 3 were sold leather-bound for 3 shillings and were duodecimos, so the competition was not based on price. Beyond 1775, editions of Hoyle proliferated seemingly without end. The epitome of Hoyle, 1783, with Beaufort and Jones's improvements to Hoyle. 1791, Hoyle abridged by Bob Short. Dozens of editions appeared until 1850. General Scott's The Beauties of Hoyle and Payne. Thank you. General Scott's The Beauties of Hoyle and Payne, appearing in nearly a dozen issues through 1810. 10 editions and issues of Piggott's New Hoyle, the first from 1796. 1802, the first of 5 editions of the New Pocket Hoyle. In 1830, Robert Hardy's Hoyle Made Familiar was the first stereotyped edition and appeared more than a dozen times. And there were 6 editions of Hoyle's Games Improved and Enlarged, the first from 1835. To those books, we can add uncountable cheap editions, occasionally with crude but charming frontispieces, such as those you see here, generally not leather-bound, but issued in printed wrappers. There are even more and uncountable numbers of cheaper chapbooks, a very small sample of which is shown here. As I have studied these books, I have learned to read their story. I'd expected the story would be evolution in the strategy of the games treated. That Hoyle's Games Improved would be improvements in how to play whist. But that is not the story these books tell at all. Instead, they tell the story of the 18th and 19th century London book trade. I call the story Proprietors versus Challengers. The proprietors are those who owned the Hoyle copyright through 1774. What is remarkable is that despite the loss of copyright protection, the proprietors dominated the market of publishing Hoyle continuously for 125 years. The proprietor's enterprise is continuous in the sense of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, with booksellers marrying into it, young booksellers born into it, and old booksellers dying out of it. For example, bookseller Richard Baldwin bought into the Hoyle copyright in 1755. He left his share to his nephew Robert, then it went to a grandnephew, another Robert, and finally to the firm of Baldwin, Craddock, and Joy. In all, the Baldwins were involved for a period of 80 years. But overall, the Hoyle copyright was continuous in the proprietors for 125. And then there are the challengers, who published books that threatened the proprietors' profits, copying titles and text. Surprisingly, it was the challengers who were the innovators, introducing improvements and novelty into the product. The proprietors responded aggressively, even ruthlessly, to maintain their market. It is the interplay between proprietors and challengers that makes Hoyle an interesting set of books to study. Here's how I propose to look at that interplay. First, I will demonstrate the century and a quarter of continuity that gives title to this talk. The discussion itself will be in pieces. A brief look at the Hoyles through 1774, a closer look at the last years of perpetual copyright and their impact on Hoyle. Finally, we will look at the proprietor's longevity for the full century and a quarter. Next, we will look at 3 of the many challengers: Robert Withy, Charles Pigott, and the New Pocket Hoyle. In looking at the challengers, I will, with one exception, ignore cheap abridgments in chapbooks and focus on the books that included the full text of Hoyle and matched the proprietor's price. Let us move on to the first part of the century and a quarter when Hoyle was copyright protected. My treatment will be brief, not because the story is unimportant or uninteresting, but because it is really another hour lecture dealing with piracy and Hoyle's autograph in genuine copies of his work and a bookseller's bankruptcy. As we look into these early books, I'd like you to focus on two questions. First, who are the proprietors? And second, what was the copyright worth? We begin inevitably with the first edition of Hoyle's first book, a short treatise on the game of whist from 1742. It is not a stretch to say that this is the most important book ever written on a card game. It is the first book that deals with the strategy of card play, as is evident in a phrase in the long title. Some rules whereby a beginner may, with due attention to them, attain to the playing it well. Interestingly, Hoyle presumed that you knew how to play whist. If you did not, the book is unintelligible. The rules were rules of strategy and not rules for the mechanics of the game. The book is printed by John Watts for the author, meaning that Hoyle published the book himself. Hoyle, then, is our first proprietor. After Hoyle had sold all his copies of whist, he sold the copyright to the chronically unsuccessful bookseller Francis Cogan, and pirates reprinted whist before Cogan could print a second edition. Cogan obtained an injunction against them in the Chancery courts, and here you see the complaint, from which we learn that Cogan paid £105 to Hoyle for the copyright. And this is the first evidence that we have of the value that the book trade was willing to place on the Hoyle copyright. In the next 2 years, Hoyle wrote and Cogan published additional treatises on the games of quadrille, piquet chess, and backgammon, and reprinted whist through a fifth edition. Cogan, in financial difficulty, sold the Hoyle rights at an unknown price to the much more successful bookseller, Thomas Osborne Jr. Osborne, the third proprietor, reprinted the individual treatises and combined them in an oft-reprinted book that came to be known as Mr. Hoyle's Games. In many ways, this book, advertised for Christmas, 1756, is the iconic Hoyle. Though styled an 11th edition, it is the first to bear the familiar title, Mr. Hoyle's Games. The title page has a multi-column list of games treated in black letter, a styling often replicated in newspaper advertisements. Hoyle's autograph appears at the bottom of the title page as a guarantee of authenticity. Thomas Osborne remained the lead publisher, even though he had sold 1/3 shares each to James Hodges and Richard Baldwin, whom we see on the imprint here. The terms of those transactions are not known. By 1763, after a 12th but before a 13th edition, proprietor James Hodges was knighted and left the book trade. He sold his copyrights at an auction sale open to the trade. Lots 312 and 313 are for shares of Hoyle, divided into 2 lots of 1/6 share each. Bookseller and printer Henry Woodfall purchased those lots for a total of £62.10, meaning the full copyright was worth £187.10, nearly double the £105 Cogan paid 20 years earlier for whist alone. In ill health only a month before his death in 1767, Thomas Osborne sold his 1/3 share in a similar trade sale. The total was £87, implying £261 for the full copyright. The purchasers were Woodfall, Stanley Croder, and John Wilkie. The reformed proprietors published an unchanged 14th edition later that year. Here is a chart for tracing the ownership of the Hoyle copyright. Each column is an edition, each row an owning bookseller. The details are not important, but you get a sense of the frequency and timing of the publication. You can also see continuity of ownership from Hoyle to Kogan to Osborne and ending with 4 proprietors in 1767. We are now inching towards the Donaldson decision, when Hoyle would lose its protection. Let us briefly recap the 18th century copyright scheme. The Statute of Anne, passed in 1710, gave authors a 14-year copyright in their work, with an additional 14 years should they be alive at the end of the first term. The London trade, however, behaved differently. Under common law, you own your land, your horse, your property forever. The same, they argued, applied to the right to print a book. The Statute of Anne did not eliminate a common law right of perpetual copyright, but instead granted additional remedies. The courts upheld the notion of perpetual copyright until 1774, when in a much anticipated decision, the House of Lords rejected perpetual copyright in the case of Donaldson and Beckett. From that point, anyone could reprint Hoyle. The Donaldson decision is a paradox. On the one hand, it was widely anticipated by the trade. On the other hand, it was very disruptive. How did the Hoyle proprietors prepare for Donaldson? How did the disruption impact the publishing of Hoyle? Let us continue the narrative in 1767, when proprietor Osborne passed away. Sadly, Hoyle was the next to die. His 1769 obituary notes that last Tuesday died in Welbeck Street, Cavendish Square, aged 97, Edmund Hoyle, Esquire. With his death, the authorial text is forever frozen. The deaths of neither Osborne nor Hoyle affected the value of the copyright. In February 1771, Richard Baldwin sold a 1/12 share to Thomas Lowndes at a price that values the entire copyright at a record £273. The receipt for that transaction survives in the British Library. The proprietors, now 10 in number, brought out an unchanged 15th edition later that year, reproducing the late Hoyle's autograph with a woodblock. This is the book that you would have seen in 1774 visiting a bookseller. Perhaps when Osborne was the lead publisher, he wanted to maintain close control, but with his death, the imprint of the 15th edition shows a greatly expanded list of proprietors. Why the expansion? The increased numbers reduce the risk of piracy. A piratical printer would be less willing to alienate a large consortium of booksellers than a smaller one. The smaller shares of each proprietor reduce the financial risk of publishing. Perhaps the larger number anticipates Donaldson in another way. The more booksellers invested in the Hoyle property, the fewer competitors there might be, absent copyright protection. Note the name of Samuel Bladen on the imprint. In 1772, the last of Hoyle's core texts was 28 years old, protected only by the bookseller's claim of copyright, the claim rejected in Donaldson. Donaldson had no immediate impact on Hoyle. The 15th edition did not go out of print until the summer of 1775, and that's when a first challenger appeared. For the first time, legal competition came to the market for instructional gaming literature, and on June 2nd, Samuel Bladen, a proprietor of the 15th edition, published Hoyle's Games Improved by James Beaufort. How does Beaufort improve Hoyle? He edited the text for readability, a great improvement to my mind. Beaufort added rules for each game, something neglected by Hoyle. For the first time, someone who did not know the mechanics of whist or backgammon could learn from a book written in English. As a final improvement, Beaufort added rules for 2 new games, billiards and tennis. Notably, Beaufort made no changes to the strategies suggested by Hoyle. As a shareholder of the 15th edition, Bladen must have known that the proprietors, now without him, were prepared to bring out a 16th edition the week following. That 16th edition is unchanged from the 14th or 15th and lacks Beaufort's improvements. That came out on June 9th, 1 week after Beaufort. The reviewers were unsure what to make of this new choice. Mr. Beaufort may possibly have out-Hoyled Hoyle. For our part, we are ignorant in this science. The proprietors must have been cross with Bladen and responded dramatically. 5 weeks later, on the 15th of July, 1775, they stole his title and published a third book, Hoyle's Games Improved, this revised and edited by Charles Jones. The list of proprietors on the Jones Hoyle is the same as the 16th edition. The proprietors stole more than the title. They also stole most of the improvements. Like Beaufort, they added game rules and material on billiards and tennis, yet they did more. To use a poker analogy, the proprietors saw Beaufort's billiards and tennis and raised with 4 new games: quinze, hazard, lansquenet, and cricket. What is remarkable is that the proprietors, now 13 in number, can afford and are willing to cannibalize the sales of their own 16th edition. Only 5 weeks on the market. These are the 3 instructional books on games available to the gamester in the summer of 1775. The differences are only content, not price or format. Each is a 3-shilling duodecimo in a cheap leather binding. The market for gaming literature was up for grabs. Before looking at the winner, let us look at how Beaufort and the proprietors reacted over the next few years. Beaufort merely whines. On March 3rd, 1778, he advertised in St. James's Chronicle, "Mr. Beaufort hopes the public will not confound his work with an obsolete book of the same kind, the proprietors of which have not only stolen his plan, but purloined his title. As he is justly apprehensive, his reputation will suffer by the mistake." While Beaufort was complaining, the proprietors pressed on, planning a new edition of the Jones Hoyle with even more improvements. They purchased the copyright of 2 gaming books to include in their next edition, which wouldn't appear until 1779. First, they paid John Dew 8 guineas for his unpublished work on billiards. This receipt, dated the 6th of August, 1776, is at the British Library. Dew's work was vastly more comprehensive than the brief sections on billiards in either of the 2 1775 versions of Hoyle's Games Improved. The second purchase was the copyright to An Introduction to the Game of Draughts by William Payne, the late brother of one of the proprietors. The proprietors paid 5 guineas for the book on February 11th, 1779, with the receipt again at the British Library. As an aside, this book on drafts, first published in 1756, is most remembered today for its introduction by Samuel Johnson, a connection that has defeated me every time I try to buy a copy at auction. Given the actions of Beaufort and the proprietors, it won't surprise you to learn that the proprietors won the battle. Everyone seemed to prefer the Jones Hoyle. The London Review described it as the most complete work of its kind extant. Pirates preferred Jones as well. When anonymous pirates entered the market in 1778, it was the Charles Jones Hoyle they copied, not that of Beaufort. Note the list of games includes the addition of cricket, quinze, hazard, and lansquenet. The author is given as Thomas Jones, a name invented to create confusion with Charles Jones. The publisher, W. Wood, is also fictitious, concealing the pirate's identity. The italic letterpress signature recalls the woodblock autograph of Hoyle. But the most important vote was from readers. The Beaufort Hoyle was reprinted just once in 1788, but 10 more editions of the Jones Hoyle appeared from 1779 to 1826. Each new version had materials on additional games. Our proprietors maintained market leadership, even as Donaldson stripped them of copyright protection. In a chart like the one we saw earlier, and pay no attention to the details for sure, we can trace the continuity of publishing the Jones-Hoyle through half a century, from 1775 to 1826, and through 11 editions. The Baldwins on the top row were the only bookseller with a share in all the editions, but you can see others buying and selling into the property. One notable name among the proprietors is Beckett, the defendant in Donaldson and Beckett. It is ironic that Samuel Bladen, who published the failed Beaufort Hoyle, again became a proprietor in 1786. His partners must have forgiven him. Finally, the Longman firm became a proprietor in 1790. Their involvement is important because their business records survive, revealing much about the publication of Hoyle. From the beginning of the Longman's involvement, we can see the precise ownership of shares in parts as small as 1 in 144, and we'll see another example of what can be learned from their archives shortly. Yet Donaldson did have one impact. When the rights to the Jones-Hoyle are traded, the price is much lower than before Donaldson. On March 17, 1788, William Goldsmith sold a share of 1 part in 72 for £1.15, implying a full value of £126, less than half the price of the Hoyle, £273, 5 years earlier. The last edition of the Jones-Hoyle appeared in 1826, but the proprietors were not done. They hired another editor, G. Herman, to refresh the property. The proprietors published 6 editions of a new title, Hoyle's Games Improved and Enlarged, the first in 1835, the last in 1868. We've seen an ever-changing but continuous group of proprietors who published Hoyle for a century and a quarter, from 1742 to 1868. We saw one challenger, Samuel Bladen, publishing James Beaufort's Hoyle's Games Improved, and saw how quickly and dramatically the proprietors responded. Time does not permit us to look at all of the other challengers, but let us take a brief look at 3 more. Let me digress for a moment of biography, because our next challenger completely fascinates me. Robert Withy, 2 careers, 3 wives, 11 children, a stint in jail, and membership in social clubs, such as the Society of Eccentrics and the Brilliants. Born in 1732, he was apprenticed to bookseller John Rivington at age 15 and freed of the stationers 7 years later. He set up shop at the sign of the Dunciad in Cornhill, as shown in the lovely broadside on the left. Later, as seen on the right, he partnered with John Ryle at Hogarth's Head, opposite Salisbury Court, Fleet Street. He left the book trade in 1767 to become a stockbroker and auctioneer. A trade card from Withy's brokerage business survives from about 1780. As a broker, Withy got into trouble almost immediately in a rotten borough scheme. A man named Joseph Hickey attempted to procure property in Milburn Port to obtain a seat in Parliament, using Withy as an intermediary. Hickey was convicted and sent to Newgate Prison. Withy was imprisoned to obtain his testimony and was later freed. It is the other side of this trade card that brings Withy into the Hoyle story. The title is 12 Short Standing Rules for Short Memories of the Game of Whist. The rules by the pseudonymous Bob Short begin, lead from your strong suit, lead through an honor. Although the rules are extracted from Hoyle, no mention is made of Hoyle on the card. A 1781 newspaper advertisement makes the connection with Hoyle explicit. This day published, neatly printed on a card, price only 2 pennies, or 1 shilling a dozen, Hoyle abridged, by Bob Short. Withy's innovation is to reduce the text of Hoyle's Whist to a concise, memorable list of 12 maxims of strategy. These rules did not yet attract the attention of the proprietors. Withy entered an expanded work in the Stationers' Company Book of Register in February 1785, It was called A Present for Grown Masters and Misses, Hoyle Abridged by Bob Short. This longer booklet certainly attracted the attention of the proprietors. Note the signature of John Wilkie in the lower right, recording Withy's copyright and accepting the deposit of 9 books on behalf of the company. Wilkie was a Hoyle proprietor at the time. Contemporary advertisements show that Withy sold the book at 3 pence, or 2 shillings per dozen. Sadly, no copies of this book survive, but there is a slightly later sheet at the British Library that is a provincial extract of the book. The sheet has an incorrect date in pencil of 1801. It must have been from the late 1780s, while printer J. Fowler was still in Salisbury. One side of the sheet contains 12 short standing rules for ladies with short memories, identical to those that appeared on the back of the trade card. The other side has 12 longer rules for gentlemen with short memories. How do our proprietors respond? They are not interested at competing at the price point of 3 pence when they are selling the Jones Hoyle for 3 shillings. They are, however, interested in the contents. When the proprietors publish a 3rd edition of the Jones Hoyle in December 1786, they include a new section, 24 Short Rules for Learners. The rules are plagiarized from Withy. Compare Withy's lead from your strong suit with the proprietors, always lead from your strong suit, and so on. The proprietors simply steal from Withy. Withy had one more go at whist. In 1791, he published Hoyle Abridged, a 24-page chapbook priced at 6 pence, printed on fine writing paper, the size to bind with Goldsmith's Almanac. He expands the short rules to 29 in number and extracts more material from Hoyle. One novelty is instructions for keeping score at whist. At a time when paper was dear, whist players scored a 10-point game with a set of 4 metal tokens arranged to indicate the score. This is the first appearance in English of a system that came to be known as Hoyle's scoring method, although Hoyle himself had nothing to do with it. One could purchase sets of 4 scoring counters, such as this one. This counter shows that false imprints are not limited to books. The date of 1747 is too early by at least half a century. The proprietors appropriate the method for scoring at whist. In 1796, a 5th edition of the Jones Hoyle includes 2 different diagrams for scoring whist with counters, one copied from Withy. Amusingly, the proprietor's diagram was a bit unclear, and they felt the need to correct it in an erratum at the end of the table of contents. One of the counters belonging to 7 is placed too near 8. They should stand more distinct thus. What is notable is the interplay between Withy and the proprietors. Withy digests whist to 24 rules in the mid-1780s. The proprietors copy the list in 1786. Withy introduces a method of scoring with counters in 1790, and the proprietors copy that in 1796. Another challenger is Charles Louse Piggott, a notorious figure in the London club scene. His book, The Jockey Club, was published anonymously, offering a scurrilous account of London elites. Refusing to identify the author, the publishers, James Ridgway and Henry Simmons, were sent to Newgate Prison for seditious libel. Piggott himself found another path to Newgate, seditious toasting. On February 1st, 1796, Ridgway, and likely Simmons as well, challenged the Hoyle proprietors with this new Hoyle, purportedly from the manuscript of the late Charles Piggott, who had died 2 years earlier. Hoyle's text was streamlined, and 4 games made a first appearance in any edition of Hoyle. Ridgway's timing was a bit off. The new Hoyle appeared just 5 weeks before a 5th edition of the Jones Hoyle was to appear. 5 weeks in 1775 allowed the proprietors to copy all of Beaufort's improvements. 5 weeks in 1796 allowed the proprietors to add material on Pigot's 4 new games and include another 2, Casino and Connections. The next month, Ridgway reissued Pigot's new Hoyle with a canceled title and an addenda, matching the material on Casino and Connections and adding 2 new games, all 4 input, plus a short treatise on the statutory laws regulating gaming. Of course, a 6th edition of Jones matched the new games in Pigot and added more in 1800, and a 7th edition of 1803 added Lewin Lottery. Pigot did not catch up until 1804. I'm left to wonder, did Pigot really leave a manuscript, or was bookseller Ridgway trading on Pigot's notoriety? Obviously, the editions made after Pigot's death were written by someone else who wrote the original text. We'll have time to look at one more challenger. In 1802, the firm of Wynne and Scully, together with James Wallace, published a charming work called The New Pocket Hoyle. First advertised in August, it treated card games only and was issued leather-bound at 5 shillings 6 and in this charming slipcase pictured here for 4 shillings. The slipcase reads, "The New Pocket Hoyle, or a companion to the card table." It seems that it was the slipcase format that threatened the proprietors. As usual, they responded aggressively and audaciously. The response was this book, Hoyle's Game Improved and Selected as a Companion to the Card Table. It was issued in a slipcase, which, like the book by Wynne and Scully, was labeled Companion to the Card Table. Notably, the proprietors priced this book at 3 shillings 6, 6 pence less than the challenger. The book has quite a story. One thinks of booksellers as financiers and printers as tradesmen. We think of neither as engineers, yet the origin of this book is clever engineering. The story begins with the Jones Hoyle of 1800, the book that was in print when Wynne and Scully published The New Pocket Hoyle in August 1802. Seeing that challenge, the proprietors began to plan the next edition of the Jones Hoyle. The proprietors reordered the games. Note that the board games of chess, backgammon, and drafts were moved from the beginning of the book to the end. Likewise, the outdoor games of cricket and tennis. For the first time, the text that was Hoyle's original writing did not appear consecutively at the beginning of the book. Why? The effect of this reordering is to put all of the card games first, and that was what allowed for the clever bit of engineering. When you compare the 1803 companion to the card table with the first half of the 1803 Jones Hoyle, it is evident that they were printed from the same setting of type. Here you see the collations of the 2 books. The top row is companion, and the second, the Jones Hoyle. Both are imposed in 18s and gathered in 6s. Companion consists of the first 5 sheets of the larger 11-sheet work, gatherings B through Q, which cover only the card games. We are fortunate to have business records for both the printer and the publisher. The printer was Charles Whittingham of the Chiswick Press, whose business records are at the British Library. The archives of the Longman firm are at the University of Reading and have been filmed by Chadwick Healy. Both sets of archival records confirm a print run of Companion of 1,000 copies and a print run of the full Jones Hoyle at 3,000 copies. That means that 4,000 copies of the first 5 sheets were printed and 3,000 copies of the remaining gatherings. This sharing of type between 2 works is something I have not seen discussed in the literature, and I'd be anxious to hear of further examples the audience might suggest. This sharing of type had 3 benefits for the proprietors. First, it reduced time to market. Wynne and Scully advertised The New Pocket Hoyle on the 19th of August, 1802. Whittingham's printing records are precise as to dates of composition and payment for the work. Within a month, printing started for Companion and continued to January of 1803. The proprietors paid Whittingham for the printing of 4,000 sheets of gatherings B through Q and issued 1,000 copies of Companion, advertised for sale on the 1st of February. They must have warehoused the remaining 3,000 copies of gatherings B through Q. From February through May, Whittingham printed the additional 6 sheets to make up the full Jones-Hoyle. The proprietors paid for those in May, but with unsold copies of the 1800 edition, the additional sheets must have been warehoused as well. The Jones-Hoyle, although dated 1803, was not advertised until the 20th of January, 1804, nearly a year after the Companion with which it shared type. The shared type also reduced costs for the proprietors, a second benefit. Both printing and publishing records provide details of costs. I don't want to try your patience with performing calculations involving pre-decimal currency, so you'll have to trust me that the cost of composition of the 5 sheets shared by the 2 books is £13.10. Since Companion accounts for only 1,000 of the 4,000 copies, it should bear only 1/4 the cost of composition, a savings of more than £10. This works out to be a bit less than 2.5 pence a copy, and that is a satisfying number because it allows the proprietors of Companion to sell the book at 3 shillings 6 versus 4 shillings for the Wynne and Scully book and still maintain their margin. A final advantage of the shared type is it allows the proprietors to segment the market, having 1 book for those interested in card games only and a 2nd book for those interested in board games and outdoor games as well. The preface to Companion notes that they have decided to divide Hoyle's Games Improved into 2 nearly equal portions, one calculated for the card table and most suitable to the ladies, the other appropriate to the male sex, as containing games that require stronger exertion or more intense application. Their claim is gendered and disingenuous. As I've demonstrated, the proprietors divided the book into 2 to prevent the New Pocket Hoyle from eroding their sales. Gender had little to do with it. It seems the proprietors had won this battle as well. A 2nd edition of the New Pocket Hoyle appeared in 1804 and 3 more in 1807. The full Jones-Hoyle continued through 1826, and the proprietors extracted Companion again in 1808, 1813, and 1820. The value of the copyright confirms the winner. On the 18th of June, 1803, 4 months after the first month of the proprietor's Companion was published, James Wallace sold his 1/3 share of the New Pocket Hoyle for 8 guineas. The nearest transaction in the Jones copyright was from a few years earlier with a value of more than £200. The proprietors would use this technique, multiple books from a single setting of type, many times in the life of the Jones-Hoyle. In addition to the 4 appearances of Companion, they published a 2nd extract containing the first 2 card games, Whist and Quadrille, in 1813 and 1820, and there were more than a dozen other extracts. Some final comments. Today, we have looked at books not so lofty as Moby Dick. Hoyle is much more of a workhorse than a whale, a reliable seller that could be reprinted in large quantities every few years. What can be learned from this study of Hoyle? First, Donaldson had a surprising impact on this genre of literature. The expected outcome of the end of a monopoly is lower prices. And yes, there were abridgments and beauties and chapbooks and the like, which other than Withy, we have not examined today. But apart from those cheaper works, there was intense competition at an undiminished price. Hoyle was not selling at a monopoly price in 1774. The end of the monopoly had a different effect. The text of Hoyle was virtually unchanged for 3 decades preceding Donaldson. The end of monopoly brought innovation, clearer prose, the addition of game rules, treatment of new games, and more. A product that had been stagnant for decades was continually expanded and improved once monopoly protection ended. Second, proprietors versus challengers provides a framework to place any particular copy of the hundreds of different Hoyles that exist. As you look at a particular book, you can ask the question, was it published by the proprietors or by a challenger? Or was it a cheap book at too low a price to draw the proprietor's attention? What innovations might have been introduced into the book? What was copied from competitors? The final lesson is understanding how the proprietors maintained their market dominance. They studied their competition and copied whatever threatened them, ruthlessly and urgently. They relied on superior financing available because of their many shareholders. For example, they were willing to cannibalize the sale of the 16th edition of Hoyle's games by publishing the first of the Jones Hoyles just weeks later. They aggressively purchased additional copyrights to expand the work, and most interestingly, they were clever engineers, issuing multiple titles from a single setting of type, sometimes in a rush to market, but more generally to save composition costs and appeal to different audiences. I hope you agree with Terry Bellinger that there is something to be learned from examining non-canon work. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, David, very much. That was fascinating. I hope you clearly vindicated you'll be willing to take some questions.
Absolutely.
When we come to them, I just have 1 or 2 comments. So when we come to them, anyone in the room will be using a handheld microphone. So if you just wait a moment for it, I think Yvonne is going to be passing it around. And anyone listening at home, if they could please submit questions on the online chat function, they will reach us. But just one observation that I have is it's clear that the very large number of these editions and piracies of these handbooks are clear evidence of the enormous popularity of these games. And they seem to offer a very appealing glimpse into Georgian drawing rooms. There was one rather nice advertisement that we've just seen referring to recreation for winter nights. This, I suppose, was before the age of a Netflix, so you could sort of play your various games. One question that I had is how accurate are the edition statements? When you start getting into 15th and 16th editions, are they advertisement or are they actually reliable?
That's a great question, and to answer that fully would probably take 15 minutes. There's a logic to how the editions are numbered, but to be very brief, Whist was published separately in a 1st through 7th edition. The first time all of the different treatises on all the games were brought together, they called it an 8th edition, continuing the number from the 7th. It's really the 1st edition of a new work rather than an 8th edition, and then you start getting into reissues with canceled titles where they increment the stated edition.
To indicate popularity.
To indicate popularity, to separate one bookseller who was selling it from another bookseller. It's crazy, it's annoying. What's really funny about the edition statements is there are statements of addition on the section titles for the different games. So PK will be a 2nd edition or a 3rd edition or a 4th edition, and that statement is completely meaningless. Yet booksellers and catalogers routinely record that.
I can imagine big complications. Thank you for that. Questions either in the room or online?
Thank you. Thank you, David, very much for a wonderful paper. I think I'm never entirely going to understand the ramifications and consequences of the challenge to the 1710 Copyright Act. I mean, it's so complicated. The one thing that I took away from this particularly was the anticipation. You were talking about the anticipation of Donaldson and Beckett. So we've got 20, if I understand this, so the 28-year formal expiry comes in the early 1770s. And then there's this period between then and 1775, 24, 75. Could you just repeat how that anticipation of the verdict was seen?
So I think two things happen. One is the death of Thomas Osborne in 1767, and he really closely held on to the copyright, never allowing his share to dwindle below a third. Once he got out, the shares were divided up among first 10, then 12, then 14 proprietors, and I believe that was in anticipation of Donaldson. That was to reduce the number of booksellers who might publish a competing edition. It was to insulate, to make a printer fear that if you pirate the book, you'll be offending a lot of people, and it also reduced your financial investment in the copyright so that piracy did appear. You'd only have a 1/12 share instead of a full share. So I think that the increase in number of proprietors is how they anticipated, but because it happened at the same time that Osborne died, it might have happened anyway.
Thank you, David. That was very interesting. Also for a person like me who knows nothing about games. Obviously, the book was very popular. It sold a lot of copies. I was wondering, is there any evidence of these copies actually being used? You say, you know, in the drawing rooms, the long winter evenings, people played these games. I'm sure they do. You have but to read contemporary novelists to find they're always playing games. But in the contemporary novels, I never read anything about using rules or teaching rules. Have you any evidence about the use?
So I'll give you one contemporary novel that has a Hoyle reference in it, which is Tom Jones, 1746. There's a passage, and I can't quite quote it from memory, but the master comes home and finds 4 servants playing at whist with a copy of Hoyle, my best Hoyle, with a quantity of porter spilled on one of the most material leaves. So that's kind of a pleasant anecdote. And one nice thing about it is the master wants a guinea that he paid for the book. The servant wants to reimburse him for the price of the piracy, which was only a shilling. In terms of looking at the physical books that survive, I see much evidence of use in the early Hoyles, the first 30 years. Many copies have notes. The bindings rarely are original, or if they are original, they're in desperate shape. One of my favorite examples is there's an error that was introduced by a compositor in a particular edition of Hoyle, and I've seen 6 or 7 of the 10 copies, and in most of them, it's corrected by hand, in a different hand. So somebody is reading it carefully enough.
Yeah, that's what I meant, yeah. Notes or underlinings. Or
And there's also later books where people disagree with Hoyle, which is also quite fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's fascinating. We tend to think of proprietors of copies of publishers as very practical people, very hard-headed, concerned with the bottom line. But they're also gamblers, aren't they? Most obviously when they're investing in a property such as Hoyle. So I'm wondering if you see any kind of instinct for gaming or even pleasure-seeking in putting out this title, which is about pleasure. And even, or perhaps a kind of reverence for tradition in keeping it going in print because it's such a well-known title. I mean, are they solely interested in profit, or are there other kind of motives, do you think, at play?
So that's an interesting question. I think what I would say is You're investing in a belief in the future, and there's a range of outcomes, just as when you play cards and you play a card, and there's a range of outcomes that can result from that. There is a mix of skill and luck, and you can't tell necessarily from the outcomes whether they were due to skill or luck. I see Thomas Osborne, I see Richard Baldwin, I see the Longmans as very high on the skill side. I see Francis Kogan, I see the Beaufort Hoyle as low skill, bad outcome. I don't know what to say about people like Ridgway. He published 10 editions of the Pigott Hoyle, spent time in jail for his other publishing activities. Was he unlucky to end up in jail? Was he unintelligent for deciding to publish that work? I don't know how to answer the question overall, but I think that's the, if you think about a range of outcomes that are probabilistic, that's probably the best way to think about publishing and game playing.
That was, I've been listening to your lectures on Hoyle for the best part of 12 years now, and that was quite superlative. And for those of us who dabble, I think we're just left to despair now. It was phenomenal. I'm going to ask a question on one small detail, which is looking at the pocket companions to the card table and slipcases that came out in the early Regency period. It occurred to me that we were familiar with seeing slipcases used for maps and for linen-backed games at the time, but were slipcases something that were used for little instructional manuals at the time, or was that something that was innovative in this particular field? Did this introduce it as a new format other than the cheaply leather-bound or the cloth-bound or just paper wrapper book?
Well, it's very funny. When I took David Pearson's class in bindings, I asked quite nearly that question, and David had not spent time examining slipcases, and I think it's really hard to do. There just aren't a lot of examples. There is one book that I think could legitimately fit into the Hoyle saga from 1785 that is Every Man a Good Card Player, and it's kind of an abridgment of Hoyle in a slipcase. There's only 1 or 2 copies that survive in the slipcase, and it's beautiful. That's the first use I've seen of it. It's really early. If you look at, I forget the author, but there's a book within the past 10 years on dust jackets that includes a section on slipcases. And 1802 is as early as you're going to find for slipcases, and the 1785 wasn't treated then. So I don't know that there's any particular connection between the slipcase and gaming manual, but as you say, you see them for maps, you see them for almanacs, you see them for linen-backed games, you see them for many things. I wish I knew more.
Well, thank you, David. Having had the privilege of seeing your collection at a formative stage, I'm confident you can answer any question. But the question I had related to the coffee house endorsement. And if you look at the 16th edition of Hoyle, you find that it's the White and Sanders are mentioned there, whereas if you look at the Jones of more or less the same date, it's changed to White and Stapletons. Now, were these real endorsements? Did they matter? How did the relationship to the coffee houses work?
So I only have speculation about that. I have not researched it. I don't think the coffee houses published rules. I think there was only one set of rules, and those were Hoyle's. And so when it says, as played at, it just says they're using Hoyle's rules too. And by rules here, it actually means something quite specific and not obvious, because Hoyle did not treat the mechanics for how to play whist. Hoyle had what he called his laws, the laws of whist, and there were some 24 of them, more or less at different times. They were, what do you do when there's an irregularity? So if you imagine whist being played in a home, drawing room, or in a coffee house, there is no director like you would get at a modern bridge tournament. So if there's any disagreement, what do you do? If someone turns up a card inadvertently, if dealing produces one too many cards for one player and too few for another, what do you do? And Hoyle's laws were the first decisions about what to do about those, and they were universally adopted, I believe.
So there's a question from JP Asher online. You've done a huge amount of bibliographical description along with reading collateral archival evidence. Can you reflect at this point in a massively impressive project on their interaction and individual value?
Well, thank you, JP. That's actually a really good question, and a very typical JP question for those of you who don't know him. So I would answer it like this. So how do you do this kind of work? So I picked, if we just focus on the English titles, there's probably about 200 for the time period I really care about. And to tell the story, to understand the archival evidence, to understand how one book relates to another, how the publishers were thinking about the books, you can't begin to have that discussion intelligently until you've done the descriptive bibliography work. You need to run through and figure out what are real editions in a bibliographical sense, what are reissues, and just do that heavy lifting to have scaffolding to place everything else on. If you remember the slide that I had ping pong with Piggott, it talks about Piggott does something, Jones does something, and the Piggott book is reissued with a canceled title. Unless you do the bibliographical work, that wouldn't make sense. The other addition I would say is newspapers are so helpful. Printing dates are mostly right, but sometimes wrong. And to understand what happened in 1775, it's not enough to look at the 3 books that we looked at and say they were all published in 1775. You need to know that the first was on June the 2nd, the second was on June the 9th, and the other was a month later. So it's meticulous attention to detail to build the scaffolding that lets you tell a story.
Any other questions in the room? I think the number of questions and the range of questions is evidence of the enthusiasm of the audience. So please join me in thanking David for a really fascinating talk. All can be continued out in the entrance hall over a glass of wine, so I hope everyone can join us.